In this tutorial, we're going to show you how you can create components from the vector file that we created in a previous session in order for us to model the Magic Beans coffee sign that you can see here. We're going to look at how we can create components using the two-rail sweep and the Create Shape tool. And we're also going to look at how we can create components from a bitmap in order for us to create a texture. So let's go to File, Close. I'm going to open an existing file. From the Magic Beans Coffee Sign project folder, I'm going to open the Magic Beans Coffee Sign vector file here. So this is the file that we created in the vector drawing session. Now I'd just like to check my job setup, so I'm going to go to the job setup icon here, and in particular I'm focusing on the modelling resolution and the appearance. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to apply quite a high modelling resolution there, so I apply more pixels to my space so I get a good quality model. Appearance, I'm going to change that to Canadian Maple, and we could go ahead and press OK. So let's just go up to the view control at the top here. We're going to look at tiling our windows vertically. That way I can see the 2D view on the left and the 3D view on the right hand side. I'm going to go into the modelling tab. And so here is where I'm able to access all of the different modelling tools in order for me to create components. We're going to start by looking at the base shapes of this sign. And so before we go ahead and create any components, I know that I'm going to be creating quite a lot in this session. We're going to look at organising our component tree right from the start. So I'm going to right click on level 1. I'm just going to rename this level and I'm going to call this one base, like so. So now I know that any components I create here will represent the base shapes of the part that I'm creating. So we're going to look at modelling the main base shape. Now you'll remember in the vector drawing session we drew these in a way that would ultimately use the two-rail sweep tool to model this base shape. So with those vectors selected, let's go into the two-rail sweep form and we can look at modelling that base shape. So I have my two vector rails selected, so the next thing I need to do is press Use Selection. Okay, I can see my rails are travelling in the same direction. The next thing that I need to do is apply my cross section. So this is the cross section that we're going to use, and it's this shape that's going to go in between these two vector rails. So with that cross section selected, I'm just going to apply that to the start node there. And we can see just by looking at this preview we're presented with a little problem. What's happening is that our cross section is attaching itself to the start points on both of the rails. We can see the start point for the red rail is here and the start point for the green rail is all the way over here. That's why we've got this mismatch of lines going through. Now ideally for a part like this we need these start points to be in parallel with each other. So to do that, let's just right click just below that red node there. I'm going to go onto the green rail, right click, use the option here to insert a start point. And so judging by the lines between the two rails, this is more of what we're expecting. So we can clearly see that this cross section is going to travel between each of those rails in order for us to give us a shape. So let's just go ahead and press Apply there. So let's take a closer look at what's happening here in the 3D view. We can see that that cross section is being swept between the two rails, and we're actually presented with a problem here. I can see that my corners aren't very flush, they appear to be twisted. And the reason for that is if we take a look at our cross section is starting at the same point on both of those rails. And we can see by looking at the rails that the red rail is a lot larger than that of the green rail. And so as that cross section is being swept around, it's actually becoming stretched between the two rails and ultimately becomes out of sync, and we can see that there. Now a way to visualise what's happening here is imagine each side of this cross section is a race car. And they're both travelling around a race track. So we've got red car on the red track, green car on the green track. Now the red car is going to have to travel a lot faster in order for it to stay in line with the green car so they both meet up back to the start point at the same time. And so to help us, what we could do is look at applying a cross section to each one of these corners. Now I know that when we created these vectors, both vectors have the same number of nodes. So I'm just going to use this option here. I'll right click on the node. I'm going to use this option, add to all rail nodes, and you'll see it's picked up all of those nodes there. So it's applied a cross section at each one of these points. So when I go ahead and press apply, and there we can see that we now have nice mitered corners there. We look around the whole part. So let's just put that back in Z view. And then we're going to use the option to uncheck scale cross sections with width, but we're going to use this option here to fill center of inner closed vector rails, and that's just going to fill this space with material. So I could go ahead and I could give this a name, so we'll call this one base, press apply, we can see how that looks. Let's just put that back in Z. Now if you wanted to know a little bit more information about the two rail sweep, then I recommend watching the two rail sweep guide, and you can find this as part of the related videos on the tutorial browser. One thing I'd like to do is just uncheck scale to an exact height. I'd like my part to scale to the height of my cross section. Then we could go ahead, apply that, and then we'll just close that form down. So the next shape that I'd like to create is going to be a recessed shape that will run between this vector and this vector here. So to do that, I'm going to select this vector, hold down shift to select the second vector, and this time we're going to use the create shape tool to create this shape. Now I'd like to apply an angled profile to this, and then for my angle I'm going to go with 60 degrees. I can see it's already input in there. For the final height, I'd actually like to limit the height of that, and I want to limit the height to 0.5. So we're going to have the shape come up at an angle. As soon as it reaches that height, it's going to flatten off. So let's just go ahead, press apply to see how that looks. Okay, so that's not too bad. However, I'm just looking for the reverse of that, so I just like that to subtract into my base shape. So here we're just going to set the option here to subtract. That's exactly what I'm looking for. We'll give that a name, so we're going to call this one recess, press apply, and then we could go ahead and start a new component. And I'd like to create a dish for the center area here. So I'm going to select this vector here. This time I'm going to go for a round profile. I'm just going to reduce that down to 45 degrees. I'm going to limit the height of that again to 0.5. I'm going to set that to subtract. And to give that a name, I'm going to call this one dish, press apply, and see how that looks there in the 3D view. Quite like that. Let's just put that back in Z, then we could go ahead and close that form down. So now that we've created the base shapes for my sign, what I'd like to do now is look at applying a texture that's going to sit within this recessed shape. Now as I'm working with a new area of my design, I'm actually going to go ahead and create a new level. So I'm just going to minimize this level. I'm going to right click, use the option here to insert a new level, right click, rename that level, and we're going to call this level texture. And so anything that I create now is going to be added to this texture level. Because I can see it's bold, it means that that is now the active level. Now the component that I'd like to create now is going to be based on a bitmap, and we have the ability to create a component from a bitmap in the software. So let's go up to this icon here, create a component from selected or imported bitmap, and then from the project folder we're going to look at bringing the coffeebeans.jpg file in there. We'll press open. Okay, so you can see it's been added in there. It's quite small, and we can see that it's been added to the component tree there. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to size this component up so that it fills the entire recessed area that we've got here. Now if I select this circle, you can see highlighted at the bottom right hand corner we displayed the width and the height of that vector. You can see it's 20 by 20. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to select my component, and we're just going to look at sizing that up so that the height of this is going to be 21. So that's just enough to clear the entire shape that we've got here. So then I could go ahead and press apply, then we could close that down. So now that we've enlarged that texture, what I'd like to do is align it to the centre of the circle. So if that's selected, I'm going to hold down Shift and select that circle. I'm going to use the alignment tools. I'm going to align it to the centre of the last object that we selected. There we go. So you can see my texture is now aligned to the centre of that circle. Now if we take a look at the texture there in the 3D view, we can see that there's quite a lot of roughness, and most images you will get will have quite a lot of noise in them, and this is purely to do with the way the image is compressed down to make the file size smaller. And so to reduce this effect, we're going to look at applying a smooth filter. So if that's selected, let's go over to the smooth filter. Okay, so it will do it to default of 50%. I'm just going to maximise that to apply a really vigorous smooth on there. Okay, so I'm happy with that, so you could go ahead, press OK, put that back in the Z view there. And I'd like to look at cropping this texture to the vectors of this recess area. So to do that, I'm going to select the component, Shift and select the outer circle, Shift and select the inner circle, and we're going to use this option here to clear area of selected component outside selected vectors. And you'll see that that's just removed everything, and I now have the texture sat here within the recess space. Now let's just take a moment to look at the texture and see how it's interacting with the rest of the model. Just maximise the 3D view and just put it in ISO view. I'm just going to zoom in a little. So we can see that that texture has been added on top of that recess shape, and we can see the angled walls of that recess shape where the texture's sitting on top. Now ideally I'd like this to all blend in together. So let's have a look at the component tree. So we can see we've got our base level at the bottom, and then on top of that level we've got the texture level. Now this texture level is currently set to add. So it's going to add anything in this level on top of the base level. So what I need to do here is I just need to change the combine mode of the texture level. So if I right click, go to combine mode, then use the option here to merge, it's going to merge everything within this level with the level below it. So you can see now we've got that texture blending into that recess shape. That's exactly what I wanted there. One final thing that I'd like to do to the texture is just alter the size. So if that's selected, let's go into the properties, and I'm just going to reduce the height down to 0.2, press space bar to enter that in, and you can see now we have a nice subtle textured background there. So I can press close, and we'll put that in the Z view, and let's go and tile our windows. So let's just minimise that level. I'm going to switch both of these levels off. What I'd like to do now is look at modelling the shapes for the leaf and the berry. So let's go and create a new level. So I'm going to right click, insert a new level, right click, rename the level, and we're going to call this level leaves. Okay, so we'll start by looking at this shape here. So I've got this circle shape, this is going to represent the berry. So we're going to go into the create shape tool. In this case I want to go with a round profile, and we're going to go with an angle 90 degrees. Okay, so you can see what it looks like so far. The moment we've got it set to limit to height, in this case I don't want to limit the height, I want the height to scale out. So I'm going to scale that to an exact height, and we're just going to put a value in here of 0.25, apply that. Okay, so you can see what that looks like there. I'm going to give that a name. I'm going to call this one berry, then we could press apply, and then we could close that down. Next component we want to look at is the leaf. Okay, so we've got two vectors here. So the way we drew this was to model the leaf using the two rail sweep. These vectors being the rails, and this vector being the cross section that will sweep between those two rails. So let's go into the two rail sweep form. And so I'm going to select my first vector, shift and select the second vector. I'm going to use the option to use selection. I can see they're both pointing in the same direction, which is good. If you found that one of your rails wasn't pointing in the same direction as the other rail, simply right click and use the option to reverse rail. So if those in the right direction, I'm going to go and select my cross section, and then let's just go ahead and press apply just to see how that looks. go in the 3D view there. Okay, so it's not too bad. You can see it's maintaining its height all the way throughout. And as we're working with quite a natural form, it's best that I use the option scale cross sections with the width. That way, where the two rails are closer together, we're going to have less height. Where they're further apart, we're going to have more height in there. So it's going to look more like an organic shape if we have that option checked. So let's press apply and we can see how that looks. Okay, I'm going to set the combine mode of this to merge, so it's blending in. And I want to scale this so that the highest point of this is going to be 1/4 of an inch. So I'll put that in there and apply that. You can see the change there. And then we'll go ahead, give that a name. We're going to call this one leaf. Press apply, and then we can close that down. So to finish this design off, what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a mirrored copy of the leaf that sits directly below this berry here. So to help me do that, all I'm going to do is just draw a line that represents the centre of this circle, the halfway point going from left to right. Now we're going to use that line in order for us to mirror this component about. So if we go into the Drawing tab, we're going to use the Draw a Polyline option. I'm going to snap to the left side of the circle, snap to the right, right click to come out of that polyline. I'm going to select my component, and then we're going to go over to Mirror Selected Objects. If I hold down Shift and select that line, you'll see that I have the option here to Flip About Line. Now I'd like to create a mirrored copy here, so I'm just going to use the option Flip About Line, and you'll see it's created that mirrored copy of that leaf below the line there. So let's close that down, then I can take that vector and I can simply delete it using the delete key. Let's just put that in the Z view for the 3D view there. And one final thing I'd like to do for the leaves is to create a copy of this little motif that we've got here over to the right hand side. So I'm going to go in the 2D view, I'm just going to shift and select all three of those components. I'm going to go over to Mirror Selected Objects. I'm going to flip that about the job center. I'm going to flip that horizontally. We want to make sure that we have Create a Mirrored Copy checked. And then when I flip horizontally, you'll see it's created a copy of those components on the right hand side of the sign that we've got there. So let's close that down. We'll go into the Modeling tab, and you can see the copies of each one of these components have been added to my component tree. We can see that they've copies because they've got the numbers in the brackets next to them. So let's switch on the texture level along with the base level. Again, we're just going to look at how everything's combining with each other. So I can see here that my leaves, everything in the leaves level is currently adding on top of the texture and on the base, and that's why we're getting this texture being transmitted through into our leaves. So what we need to do is set the combine mode of my leaves level. We're going to change that so it's merging in, so it's blending in there. Now because we're blending it in, we're actually lost a little bit of height to the texture there. So we need to think about how we're going to raise all of these components up so that they're proud of this texture here. Now an easy way to do this is just by going into the leaves level, and we can go to the properties there. You can see that I can add a base height to the actual level itself. Now if I applied a base height of 0.2 in there and then press space to enter that in, what happens is everything within that level is built on top of that base height, so everything's lifted up now by 0.2, and that enables me to now see my leaves as they're now proud of that textured recessed area that we have below it. So let's just put that back in Z, and then we're just going to close that form down. Just going to minimize the leaves level. So now we're going to look at modeling in the coffee beans in the center dish here. So to do that, we're going to right click on the leaves level, insert a new level, right click level 1, rename the level. I'm going to call this level coffee beans. Anything that I add now will be added to this level, as it's bold, it's now the active level. So I'm going to select this vector here. We're going to go and use the Create Shape from Vectors option. As we're working with organic shapes, as we're working with the coffee bean, we're going to look at applying a curved profile on this. Okay, then I can just use a slider to choose the profile. I'm just going to take that up to 90 degrees. You can see we've got quite a lot of height in there, so I'm going to look at scaling this to an exact height. So here I could try 0.3. Okay, maybe I want to just bring that down a little more, say 0.2, space to enter that in. Okay, that doesn't look too bad. Set the combine mode of that to merge. You give that a name, we'll call that one bean. Press apply. Then we could go ahead and start a new component. So now I'd like to look at the bean in the front here. So I'm going to select it. Again, we want to go with a rounded profile, 90 degrees. Let's just go ahead and press apply to see how that looks. Okay, again, it's quite bulbous here. We've got the final height set to no limit. So let's scale that to an exact height. Okay, so at the moment we're at 1/4 inch. Let's see if I can reduce that down. Okay, now it's actually coming below the bean at the back there, so I'm actually going to go with 1/4 inch in this case. I'm going to go with a combine mode of merge, so it's blending in to the bean that we've just created. However, you can still see that I'm actually losing the top part of this front bean here. So I'd like to look at a way of lifting this area up, and to do that I could look at using the tilt option. Applying a tilt is basically like applying an angled base height. So to do that, I'm going to check the tilt option. I'm going to set my anchor point. I'm going to go from the bottom underneath the bean, sort of at a 5 o'clock position here, and then I'm just going to drag my mouse out, and where we drag our mouse to is the direction of the tilt. So we're going to point it somewhere around 11 o'clock, and I'm just going to click in place, and then using the slider here I'm just going to choose my tilt. Okay, so you can see we've got a large tilt there. It's way too much. Just want to use that slider just to reduce that down until we're happy with the tilt that we have there. So if we just zoom in, we can see it's now lifted above that coffee bean, which is good. However, we just want to reduce that down a little. So 3 degrees seems to do the trick there. So let's just put that in Z there. We'll give that a name. We're going to call this one front bean. Then we could go ahead, press apply, then we'll start a new component. So then we're going to select this crease vector here. I'm going to give that an angled profile, 45 degrees. I'm going to set the final height of that to no limit. I'm actually going to subtract that into the front bean that we've got there. Give that a name. We'll call this one crease. Then we could go ahead, press apply. You can see it's been added there. So let's close that down. So looking at the beans, let's just maximise the 3D view. It looks as though the top bean has been a little washed out into the dish shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at grouping the 3 components together, and we'll look at applying a tilt just to lift the top area up. So to do that, I'm going to select crease, shift and select bean so that they're all selected, right click, use the option to group them. So now it's like one entity, but I can still access each of these components if I use the option to ungroup them. Let's just go in the Z view there, and then with that selected, I'm going to select it again to put it into transform mode. And if I press on this blue square here, you'll see that I have the option to fade it or tilt it. In this case, we're going to apply a tilt. I'm going to set the anchor point from this point here. So we're going to go up in an 11 o'clock from 5 o'clock motion here. So click here for my first point, then next point at 11 o'clock here. This is the direction of the tilt. So I'm going to click here, and then we just need to apply that angle. So let's just use a slider there, and then just zoom in on the 3D view so you can see how that looks. That's not too bad. Let's see what 1.5 looks like. Okay, so everything looks lifted there, quite like the way that that looks. So let's just close that down. We'll put that in Z. So now that we've applied that tilt, what I'd like to do is look at applying a smooth filter to this group just to give it a final finish. So if that group's selected, let's go over to smooth selected objects. Okay, it's going to warn me that we must bake this before editing. That's okay, I'm happy to do that, so we're going to OK that. What that means, it's now just turned that into one entity. I can no longer go into that group there, it's just seen as one component. Okay, so the default 50% is a little bit too much, so I'm just going to reduce that down. Okay, that's not too bad, so I could go ahead and press OK. Okay, so one thing I'd like to do is just make sure that my beans haven't come over the 0.5 depth of this dish. So I'm going to select the beans, I'm going to go into the properties, we can see that shape height is 0.5386, okay, so that's higher than the depth of the dish that they're sat in. So I'm going to look at decreasing this, I'll make that 0.48, press space to enter that in, and we can see that looks okay. I'm going to close that down, and just to ensure that nothing else is over the 0.5 height of our sign, I'm just going to use the option to scale Z height of model. We can see that the highest height there is 0.5. So we could go ahead and OK that, put that back in Z there. So let's go and tile our windows. So the last thing that we're going to model is the text fresh and coffee. So let's minimize coffee beans level, right click on the coffee beans level and insert a new level. Then we're going to rename that level, and we're going to call this one text. And we're going to select fresh, shift and select coffee. Then we're going to use the option here to create a shape from vector outlines. Okay, I'd like to give that an angled profile, so let's just up the angle there so you can see that change has taken place. I'd like to give that an angle of 75 degrees. Now, rather than have my final height set to no limit, what I'd like to do is actually limit the height of this to a precise value. So we're going to limit that to 0.4 of an inch, and then press space to enter that in. And what happens is it's going to go up at an angle 75 degrees. The moment it reaches the height of 0.4, it's going to flatten off. And so we can see that there in the 3D view. Okay, so I like the way that looks. Let's give that a name. I'm going to call this one text, press apply, and then we're just going to close that one down. Okay, so one thing here to note is that we can see that texture transmitting through the text there. Now we don't want that to happen in this case, so I need to look at changing the combine mode of my text level so that it blends in with the rest of the model. So I'm going to right click on the text level, go to combine mode, set that to merge, and you'll see it's now blending in to everything else that we've got in the model there. And I just want to look at softening that text. So we're going to select the text option. I'm going to use the smooth filter here. I'm just going to apply a little bit of a smooth just to knock off the harsh edges. So let's just say somewhere around 30%. Okay, so that looks good. I like the way that that looks. So we could go ahead and press OK. And let's just go and maximise the 3D view there. And so there we have our finished sign, where we've looked at lots of different modelling tools to create all of the components that you can see here. Now, as one final measure, I just want to use the scale Z height of model just to ensure that nothing comes above the flat height here of 0.5, and we can see that our maximum is at 0.5, so I'm happy with that. So let's go ahead and press OK. And so now we could go ahead and save that file. So go to File, Save As, and in the project folder we're going to call this one Magic Beans Coffee Sign _ 3D and Modelling. And then you could go ahead and access that from the project folder.